problems. Second, the dire human rights situation. The plight of Afghan women and girls is the starkest example of ongoing repression. I believe that this Council is united in rejecting restrictive policies that prevent the people in Afghanistan from enjoying their human rights, and that we all demand that such policies are rescinded. And I believe that we all share Ms. Wafek's call to restore Afghan women and girls' rights and dignity. The systemic human rights violations have a direct impact on the security situation. Third, the way forward. Slovenia supports the UN-led processes and the centrality and long-term engagement of the UN. The upcoming Doha III meeting can be an opportunity to start making progress. We agree that the scope of the UN approach could be cautiously widened with a view of having attainable impact on the ground. Women should have a voice in these processes, as well as a central place in any intra-Afghan dialogues, as their fate represents Afghanistan's future. Mr. President, colleagues, my country supports a coherent and structured engagement on Afghanistan, an approach that is helping Afghan people, one that brings stability, security, prosperity, and sustainable peace, one that includes women and listens to the voices of the civil society, and one that understands Afghanistan's requirement to respect its international obligations. We say this in sincere desire to help all Afghans on the road to prosperity and inclusive future development of the country. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président.
President, allow me to begin first by thanking the Special Representative, Ms. Rosa Otunbayeva, and the Director of Archer's Division of Finance and Partnerships, Ms. Lisa Doughton, for their presentations. We are also grateful to Ms. Manisha Wafek for her important and enlightening testimony. We continue to be deeply concerned about the situation in Afghanistan, and I would like to focus on three main points today. First, as the Secretary-General's report points out, Afghanistan's economic situation remains dire, and its population heavily dependent on humanitarian assistance. In this context, the restrictions that the Taliban continue to impose, particularly on women and girls, whose systematic exclusion from public life and access to quality education is preventing the Afghan people from achieving security and prosperity. In the words of Richard Bennett, and as Ms. Wafik was saying, Richard Bennett, as Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Afghanistan, the Taliban's institutionalization of its system of discrimination, segregation, disrespect for human dignity, and exclusion of women and girls, and the harms that it has entrenched, should shock the conscience of humanity. Switzerland reiterates its strong condemnation of these actions and stands in solidarity with the Afghan people, in particular women and girls, as well as ethnic and religious minorities. Respect for their human rights, fundamental freedoms, and participation in public life must remain a priority for the international community. Without this, there will be no path to an Afghanistan at peace with itself, enjoying sustainable economic growth and providing security and stability for all of its people. Secondly, children who should benefit from special protection are particularly vulnerable in Afghanistan. Switzerland welcomes the adoption of the relevant conclusions of the Working Group on Children and Armed Conflict. We are convinced that these conclusions are essential for strengthening the protection of children in Afghanistan, and we call upon all parties to implement them and on UNAMA to actively support these efforts. Thirdly, another complex crisis that deserves our full attention is climate change. Frequent droughts, flash floods, melting ice as temperatures rise, and land degradation are having serious consequences. They displace millions of Afghans, threaten their survival, and weigh heavily on an already fragile economy that is largely dependent on agriculture. The new Agenda for Peace reminds us that we must address the challenges posed by climate change and the inequalities it creates, both for the sake of the planet and for the sake of development, human rights, and our shared peace-building goals. This is particularly true in Afghanistan and the surrounding region, where growing competition for water can quickly become a factor of instability and insecurity, and can exacerbate conflicts. Only by strengthening regional and international cooperation, combined with continued support to local communities, will we be able to mitigate these challenges. We therefore encourage UNAMA to strengthen its role in promoting regional dialogue and cooperation on the impact of climate change on populations and livelihoods, and to bolster sustainable management of water resources. Mr. President, as we approach the next Special Envoy meeting in Doha, it remains imperative for us that the Afghan people in all their diversity, particularly Afghan women, be involved in all the processes related to the future of the country, including the implementation of the recommendations of the independent assessment. Their voices must be heard. Therefore, it is important that civil society representatives be invited systematically to the Doha meetings, and that adequate space be reserved for discussions on human rights, especially those of women and girls. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Special Representative Otunbayeva, Ms. Doughton, and Ms. Wafik for your briefings. Let me also thank the entire UNAMA team for its work to build a stable, prosperous, inclusive, and secure Afghanistan. We appreciate UNAMA's commitment in the face of many, many challenges. Mr. President, Secretary General's report underscores the many political, security, economic, and humanitarian challenges the Afghan people continue to face. We echo the Secretary General's call for unimpeded access to aid workers. Assistance must go to the designated beneficiaries. The Secretary General's report also highlights the serious deterioration of the exercise of human rights in Afghanistan, reinforcing last week's report of the Special Rapporteur on Afghanistan. Separate and independent UN bodies are now calling out the Taliban's systemic human rights abuses and their absolute disregard for the UN Charter. These reports outline in stark detail the Taliban's institutionalized efforts to erase women from society, sweeping gender persecution, callous treatment of persons with disabilities, and human rights abuses against members of ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities, as well as LGBTQI+ persons. The international community must continue to stand with the Afghan people, especially its women, girls, and members of marginalized communities. We must insist on reversing these oppressive measures, pushing for justice and accountability for abuses, and clarifying that human rights cannot be siloed or deprioritized. The harm caused by the Taliban's restrictions on women and girls cannot be overstated. As the SRSG has said, it has now been over 1,000 days since the Taliban banned girls from secondary schools. If these types of restrictions are allowed to continue, the pervasive and harmful impacts will affect Afghans from across the country for many years to come. We must ensure that women and civil society participants have a voice in Doha at the UN-hosted meeting of special envoys coming up in a few weeks. Their concerns must be highlighted in all deliberations on Afghanistan's future. The United States supports sustained dialogue with a range of Afghan stakeholders, including business leaders and entrepreneurs who seek to build an inclusive economic system for the benefit of all Afghan civilians. The recent tragic floods in Afghanistan highlight the need to engage with conservation and environmental civil society organizations. Finally, we continue to believe the UN has an important role to play in Afghanistan's reintegration into the international system. As part of this, the Secretary General should appoint a UN focal point to begin to produce a roadmap as called for in Resolution 2721 and should ensure this person has sufficient resources and independence to perform this function effectively. As the Secretary General noted, Afghanistan's stability and development hinge on its cooperation and connectivity with its neighbors. However, regional connectivity and cooperation alone is not enough. The international community has a role to play. A UN focal point is important to address the sizable humanitarian, economic, and human rights needs in Afghanistan today. Thank you, Mr. President.
Representative of the United States for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I also thank Special Representative Atambayeva, Director Doughton, and Ms. Wafek for their briefings. I also welcome the participation of the representative of Afghanistan to today's meeting. President, Malta commends UNAMA as it continues to work towards building a peaceful, prosperous, secure, and inclusive Afghanistan, despite the many challenges it faces. The latest report of the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Afghanistan characterizes the Taliban's institutionalized system of gender oppression as gender apartheid. The climate crisis, entrenched poverty, and the Taliban's new restrictions on NGOs and their ban on Afghan women working for NGOs and the UN have further constrained humanitarian access for those in greatest need. We stress that the participation of women in society, as well as their important contributions, would help create a more resilient Afghanistan. This is especially relevant due to estimates that, in 2024, 23.7 million people will require humanitarian assistance. We also reaffirm our steadfast support to the work by UNAMA conjointly with the UNODC to counter narcotics in Afghanistan. We remain committed to efforts to address disorders related to drug use in Afghanistan, especially through evidence-based drug treatment services, in which Malta has also financially contributed to the Health Drug Demand Reduction Program in Afghanistan. We are also concerned at the continued grave violations committed against children. We reiterate our full support to the Country Task Force on Monitoring and Reporting, including UNAMA and UNICEF. We further call on all parties to fully implement the recently adopted conclusions of the Security Council Working Group on Children and Armed Conflict. President, the Purging Commission has dismissed several Taliban members from their positions in security institutions. There are reports that some of them have been recruited by ISIL-K, who continue their attacks against the Taliban. This undermines Afghanistan's own peace and security, as well as that of the region and internationally, owing to the terrorist threat posed by ISIL-K. Ahead of Doha 3, we believe that a solution for the present or the future of Afghanistan is not possible without a legitimate and inclusive political process in which the rights of women and girls are addressed substantively throughout the agenda and the diversity of Afghanistan is represented. It cannot disregard that UNAMA has characterized as one of the world's starkest examples of the regression on women's rights. Clear strategies and human rights-based parameters should also guide our interactions with the Taliban. Further, we urge that appropriate mechanisms be established to ensure the full, equal, meaningful and safe engagement of Afghan women, human rights defenders and civil society in all related political processes. This includes the implementation of Resolution 2721. In closing, President, we reiterate our full support for UNAMA's robust mandate. Through its full implementation, we can help improve the situation of Afghanistan for the benefit of all its people. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank the Special Representative of the Secretary General, Ms. Rosa Otunbayeva, Ms. Lisa Doughton, and Ms. Mandisha Wafik. I thank them for their statements. Mr. President, for now more than 1,000 days now, more than 1.5 girls are no longer going to school in Afghanistan. And to this grim figure, with very heavy consequences for the future of the country, we need to add other violations increasingly serious of the fundamental rights of women and girls in the country. It is with concern that we learned this month that the salaries of some women in the public sectors will be cut by half. It's yet another discriminatory measure, which is one on a long list of such measures. These systematic discriminatory measures amount to a segregation policy which France firmly condemns. They have disastrous consequences for the economic future of the country and for its stability. We, therefore, here would like to thank the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Afghanistan for the remarkable work they're doing and the specialized team under UNAMA. We note with concern that all of the rights of the Afghans are being flouted daily, and notably with the return of massive and public corporal punishment. Mr. President, the security situation also remains very fragile. Terrorist groups remain active, and this has been shown regularly by the monitoring team. Daesh in Khorasan and Al-Qaeda continue presenting a regional and international security threat. These groups, we know, have found refuge in Afghanistan, and they do not hesitate to threaten or strike foreign interests, including beyond the borders of the country. Drug culture and trafficking also remains an issue of essential concern. In this context, France continue advocating for a consistent and united action on the part of the international community. This should be based on clear principles and commitments. We remain mobilized to meet the needs of the Afghan people, in particular its women and girls, in such areas as health, education, and food security. We have provided humanitarian assistance to the tune of more than 160 million since 2022, and we're committed to relocate the Afghans in France through the Women in Danger provision of the World Forum on Refugees. We also support the dialogue process initiated in Doha to the extent that it's in the service all of the Afghans, men and women, and where it has a goal of making sure the international commitments of Afghanistan are upheld. But we have to make sure that the architecture of this process is inclusive and provides for a genuine exchange on such issues as human rights. The international community has to remain mobilized to demand that the Taliban fulfill their obligations. Resolutions 2593 and 2681 have clear expectations in this regard, and their implementation is a condition of any normalization. I would like to express our support to UNAMA, to the Special Representative of Secretary General, and all of the United Nations agencies and their partners who are doing remarkable work on the ground. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank Special Representative Rosa Otunbayeva and Director Lisa Dalton for their briefings. I've also listened carefully to the statement by Ms. Manisa Wafik. President, the third meeting of Special Envoys on Afghanistan is scheduled to take place in Doha from 30th of June to the 1st of July. The Afghan interim government has confirmed its participation. China commends the United Nations for its preparations for the meeting, and we support the meeting's existing arrangements. We look forward to parties at the meeting, to parties concerned, to take this opportunity of the meeting to increase exchanges and communication with the Afghan interim government, to move towards one another so that the meeting will achieve results-oriented outcomes in such areas as microfinancing, enterprise development, anti-narcotics, and alternative cultivation, and unleash a new chapter of international engagement and cooperation with the country. We hope the Council will be promptly briefed on the meeting. We also hope that on the basis of the meeting's outcomes, the Council will take more impactful measures to assist Afghanistan in its response to development challenges and integration into the international community. Allow me to share the following 4 observations. First, the Council should support dialogue and engagement with the Afghan interim government. The international community must respect the political reality of the Afghan Taliban running the country, and through patient engagement and communication, push the interim government to gradually become more trusting of the outside outside world and to take positive initiatives in areas such as inclusive governance and safeguarding women's rights and interests as a means to address the concerns of the international community. As a crucial step in building trust, the Council should immediately reinstate the blanket travel ban exemptions for the relevant personnel of the Afghan interim government, adjust the 1988 sanctions regime in a timely way based on the evolving dynamics on the ground, and facilitate the interim government's engagement with the international community. Second, the Council should support Afghanistan in its response to humanitarian difficulties. According to the SG's report, an estimated 23.7 million Afghans are in need of humanitarian aid this year, with 90% of the households struggling to feed themselves. Out of the required humanitarian funding of $3.06 billion, a mere 16.2% is in place. The Council should urge donors to continue their humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan, refrain from substantial cuts in funding, and effectively translate their concern for the Afghan people into meaningful actions. The U.S. military intervention in Afghanistan has resulted in a major catastrophe for the Afghan people, causing them serious trauma. The United States should genuinely shoulder its historical responsibility by increasing assistance and financial input to Afghanistan rather than deserting the country once and for all. Third, the Council should support Afghanistan in removing its development bottlenecks. Economic cooperation, trade, and connective initiatives between regional countries and Afghanistan have effectively promoted its economic recovery and enhanced livelihood. That said, the Secretary-General's report also notes that regional cooperation alone cannot adequately address Afghanistan's development funding gaps or fully integrate the country into the international economic and financial system. It is concerning that the illegal unilateral sanctions imposed by certain countries on the country have seriously disrupted its financial system, hindering normal business operations and interfering with international trade and economic exchanges. These sanctions have become a prominent factor impeding Afghanistan's development. The Council should urge these countries to immediately and unconditionally end these illegal unilateral sanctions and return in full frozen Afghan overseas assets to provide necessary resources to Afghanistan's development. Fourth, the Council should support the Afghanistan interim government in its resolute fight against terrorism. Currently, terrorist forces such as Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and ETIM remain rampant in Afghanistan, threatening Afghan security and international and regional security. The Council should urge the Afghan interim government to fulfill its commitments in good faith, take vigorous measures to resolutely combat all forms of terrorist acts, and to ensure no sanctuary is provided to any terrorist forces. The international community must also assist Afghanistan in bolstering its counterterrorism capacities. In this process, it is particularly important to reject ideological prejudice, resist double standards, and eliminate selective counterterrorism. President, China thanks SISG Otunbayeva and UNAMA for their unwavering efforts during this period. We support the mission in its continuous role to forge closer communication and cooperation between the international community and Afghanistan to help the Afghanistan people in addressing their most pressing needs and achieving sustainable development. As Afghanistan's friendly neighbor, China has always firmly supported peace, stability, development, and prosperity in the country, and we remain committed to assisting the Afghan people to the fullest extent possible. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Presidente.
Thank you, President. I'm grateful for the information provided by Special Representative Rosa Otunbayeva and by the Director of the Financing Division of OCHA, Lisa Doughton, and also Ms. Menyiza Wafek, representing civil society and women. I welcome the presence of the permanent representatives of Afghanistan, Iran, India and Pakistan. The regular report sounds the alarm regarding the serious economic situation and the humanitarian challenges which continue to afflict civilians in Afghanistan. The report also addresses issues of human rights and terrorism, whose gravity must compel us to continue keeping an extremely close eye on the situation in this country. On the human rights front, the reality of women and girls is ever more bleak, with them still prevented from enjoying their most basic rights to education, employment and participation. At the moment, for over 1,000 days, millions of Afghan girls and young women have been prevented from attending secondary school and university, which makes them even more vulnerable to falling victim to sexual and gender-based violence, to child marriage and to domestic abuse, making it a matter of urgency to reverse the edicts which limit their return to the classroom. On the humanitarian front, assistance organisations are finding it difficult to operate since they are prohibited from employing female staff. This has been exacerbated by the decision by the de facto authorities to arbitrarily reduce the salaries of those women who are still working, to force them to give up. The humanitarian situation has deteriorated to a point where half the population requires humanitarian assistance to survive. The numbers of children with infectious diseases has doubled, and the efforts of the teams on the ground are limited by the gap in timely and sustainable financing. Moreover, there is no respite from terrorism. Violent incidents attributed to the Islamic State Khorasan, which is operating on Afghan territory, endanger the lives and integrity of civilians and represent a threat to peace and security in the region. Against this backdrop, the meeting of special envoys and special representatives on Afghanistan, slated to happen in Doha at the end of June, will be an opportunity, firstly, to promote inclusive intra-Afghan dialogue involving the substantive and safe participation of women, ethnic minorities and other social and political sectors. And secondly, it will motivate bilateral and regional cooperation to improve the living conditions of the population. And thirdly, it will explore the real possibilities of overcoming the restrictions of the Taliban regime upon human rights and fundamental freedoms, particularly those of Afghan women and girls. President, I wish to conclude by reaffirming the fact that we express our support for UNAMA personnel and that building a prosperous, stable, safe and peaceful Afghanistan will only be possible if civic space is revitalized and dialogue, the rule of law and national reconciliation are prioritized. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you. Thank you, President. Thank you, SRSG Otunbayeva, Director Doughton, for your briefings and for all the UN's work on the ground. Thank you also to Ms. Wafek for setting out so powerfully the damage done by the Taliban's policies on women and girls, as well as the possibilities for change. President, we welcome this opportunity ahead of the third UN-convened meeting of Special Representatives for Afghanistan for the Council to take stock, and we call for the following. First, while it's welcome that the Taliban have signalled their intention to attend this meeting in Doha, they must also show their intention to change how they are acting and to listen to the concerns of the Afghan people. The international community should remain united and clear on the urgent need for the Taliban to meet their obligations and reverse all policies restricting human rights and fundamental freedoms in Afghanistan, not least for women and girls. This includes the Taliban's decree banning girls from secondary school, now over 1,000 days since its pronouncement. This is 1,000 days too long, with half the population left behind. It is a wholly unjustifiable and self-defeating policy. Addressing these restrictions must remain front and centre for the international community in all of our engagement, as Ms. Wafek said. Second, with the 2024 Afghanistan Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan only 20% funded, we urge the international community to increase their support. The United Kingdom is on track to deliver over $190 million in aid this year, helping to meet basic needs, including through the provision of life-saving food, clean water and sanitation. And in light of continued restrictions by the Taliban, we continue to support delivery of education through bilateral and multilateral contributions to NGOs and UN partners. Finally, nearly 6 months since the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2721, we call on the UN to continue to drive forward progress on the recommendations set out in the Special Coordinator's independent assessment. A special envoy is urgently needed to bring together the international community and to minimise the risk of Afghanistan's challenges spilling over into the region and beyond. The United Kingdom stands ready to work constructively with all parties and stakeholders in Afghanistan and beyond in this shared endeavour towards an Afghanistan at peace with itself, its neighbours and the international community. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we would like to thank the Special Representative of the Secretary General and the head of the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, Ms. Otunbayeva, for her assessment of the situation in Afghanistan. The Russian Federation supports the work that's being done by UNAMA under U.S. skillful leadership within the framework of the task that the mission is entrusted with. We note that Kabul is interested in maintaining and developing contacts with you. We welcome the unwavering UN commitment to remaining there and providing the needed assistance to the people of Afghanistan. We listened very carefully to the briefing made by Lisa Doughton and the statement made by the civil society representative, and we're pleased that the regional actors will have take the floor in the discussion today. We took note of the Secretary General's report on the situation in Afghanistan, and we would like to note the following. For many years now, the UN Security Council is discussing the situation in Afghanistan. Afghanistan, in that time, has gone through a government by the Taliban in the 90s, then a 20-year-long war, which essentially resulted in the collapse of the country and the disgraceful flight of the U.S. NATO forces. And since the 15th of August of 2021, Afghanistan is once again living under the authorities of the Talib movement. The loud promises of the invaders to build a long-awaited for peace remained empty words. The people of this long-suffering country still has to tackle on their own all of the issues and challenges, and this is under the conditions of unilateral sanctions remaining and under the conditions of an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. Against this background, it is gratifying to see that the de facto authorities themselves, despite the forecasts of the Western colleagues who said that there would be an inevitable political collapse and economic crisis of the country who lived as an international dependency for a long time, the authorities nonetheless managed to clearly assess the situation and concentrated on strengthening regional cooperation and restoring the socioeconomic potential. They're looking for their own way of independent development for Afghanistan without counting on Western assistance. We share the assessment voiced by the Secretary General when he said that the internal political situation in Afghanistan is difficult. We're particularly remain concerned by security risks stemming from the fact that the ISIL Khorasan terrorist group continues active. Despite the efforts undertaken by the de facto authorities, the terrorists are increasing the influence in the country and intentionally destabilizing the situation and commit new acts of terror. We understand their intent. They want to show themselves an alternative force and undermine stability in Afghanistan and in the region. The victims of such highly publicized acts of terror are representatives of religious and ethnic minorities, including women and children. The fighters themselves confirm their funding from outside and the fact that they have foreign terrorist fighters in their ranks. ISIL periodically change their tactics and recruit new members, trying to garner new supporters. Taking into account the amount of weaponry left by the Western forces in the country, the threat that they will end up in the hands of the fighters and spread in the region, that danger is becoming very real. the drug problem is closely linked to terrorism. What the efforts undertaken by the Taliban are insufficient. What is needed is a comprehensive international regional cooperation, including through UNODC. What remains important is ensuring their support to Afghan farmers. We're also concerned by the manufacturing of synthetic drugs. What we are following very closely is the social and economic situation in the country. We note efforts made by the UN and regional organizations to provide humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan. We particularly single out the selfless work done by the humanitarian agencies and their staff, who remain ready under any conditions to remain on the ground and help the Afghan people. At the same time, we see that unfortunately these steps are not enough. The UN efforts to widen the assistance beyond the basic needs continue being blocked by the Western donors, who categorically reject any possibility of helping the country's development, helping restoring schools and hospitals, building roads which connect provinces or towns with rural areas. My country is also systematically providing targeted assistance to the needy in Afghanistan. On the 20th of June, for example, our emergency service plan delivered more than 20 tons of food and basic necessities into Kabul. And this is a fifth such plane load from Russia delivering humanitarian loads to the Afghans. We continue closely following the situation in the area of rights of all Afghans, including women and girls, and forming of truly inclusive government with the participation of all ethnic and political groups. And we expect to see positive developments in both of these tracks. Mr. President, we continue to believe that there is no alternative to a realistic, comprehensive approach to Afghanistan, and this is the approach which is shared by the Moscow Forum participants. The basis of such an approach is an objective analysis and balanced assessment of the situation and the prospects for a settlement. What remains an imperative is a constructive interaction within the international community themselves on the Afghan issue, and first and foremost, whilst fully taking into account the needs of the Afghan people themselves, and a very patient, without pressure and blackmail, dialogue with the de facto authorities on a wide spectrum of urgent issues. This is a key to the stability in the country and therefore in the region as a whole. We see that this wide pragmatic interaction is something that Taliban themselves are interested in. What we need to do is to have a clear assessment of realities on the ground and stop trying to make sure that the country does your bidding, including under the aegis of the UN. The history of the country has shown many times that such an approach is futile and counterproductive. In this regard, we note the efforts made to organize on the 30th June, 1st July, another meeting of special representatives on Afghanistan. And we're convinced that any effective discussion of the situation of Afghanistan is impossible without a direct participation in such a discussion of the de facto authorities themselves. Mr. President, the Russian Federation fully supports the right and the desire of the Afghan people to live in peace and stability. This will also determine maintaining order in the region. But building such a long-term and sustainable peace is impossible without interacting with the de facto authorities on a wide spectrum of issues. There is no alternative to this. This will determine a speedy exit from the current impasse and a subsequent international reintegration of Afghanistan. I thank you.
I thank the representatives of Russian Federation for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the Republic of Korea. I thank SRSG Ms. Otunbayeva and Director Doughton of OCHA for their informative briefings and their tireless work on the ground. My sincere appreciation also goes to Ms. Wafek for sharing insights from her expertise in supporting Afghan women's economic empowerment. I'd like to convey the following three messages today. First, to all Afghan political actors, mainly the Taliban. Legitimacy comes from the well-being of people, both physical and mental. And human rights are a powerful source of legitimacy in the eyes of civilians. In this context, we do not see any logic or justification in forcing girls beyond the 6th grade out of school for over 1,000 days now. As a major donor country that has provided $74 million of humanitarian assistance over the past 3 years, we also find the increasing interference in humanitarian activities, including violence against humanitarian personnel, ongoing restrictions on women humanitarian workers, and new regulations on the management of NGOs, utterly unacceptable. We call attention to and sympathize with the observation in the Secretary General's report that regional engagements alone cannot yield the immense financial resources required for humanitarian and development assistance or restore Afghanistan's access to international mechanisms. Indeed, Afghanistan's reintegration to the international community is a large-scale project beyond what can be done in the region alone, and there is no better entity than the United Nations to facilitate this process. The importance of the upcoming meeting of special envoys in Doha cannot be overemphasized in this regard, and it needs to be made clear that the issue of well-being and the human rights of the Afghan people, especially those of women and girls, cannot be sidelined or avoided in this forum. Second, to ourselves, including this Council and the United Nations. Engagement is an important tool in pursuing the end state of an Afghanistan at peace while meeting its international obligations. But engagement is not and should not be the goal in itself. Building on the commendable efforts of UNAMA and the Secretariat in facilitating international engagement with Afghan stakeholders, we look forward to accelerating discussions on the benchmarks, principles, and mechanisms of engagement among UN member states, including in this chamber. Finally, to the people of Afghanistan, the international community is about to initiate in-depth discussions on specific areas of concern, such as counter-narcotics, climate change, and the private sector, often referred to as entry points or confidence-building issues. In these discussions, we will always put the sufferings and the specific needs of the Afghan people in the center of our deliberations. For instance, we recently had an opportunity to connect with a young Afghan woman who leads a network of Afghan youth that aims to address climate change in Afghanistan. We listened to the difficulties related to the restrictions on NGOs, lack of climate finance, and dearth of Afghan representation in international fora. At the same time, we were encouraged that the network still manages to mobilize volunteers to support local adaptation efforts in various provinces. We believe that we should hear more of these important voices on our way forward. This is why we invited Ms. Wafek to this chamber today as well. I'd like to close my remarks by reaffirming our solidarity with the people of Afghanistan. As a country with its own experience of development from the ashes of the war, and now a strong advocate of universal values, the Republic of Korea will not lose sight of Afghanistan, especially its women and girls. Thank you. I now resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Afghanistan.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this important meeting, and we commend you for your able leadership of the Council this month. I would like to thank Ms. Rosa Otunbayeva, Special Representative of Secretary General, and Ms. Lisa Dogan, Director of Financing of OCHA Division, and Ms. Manija Wafek for her very strong and messages and echoing the voice of Afghan women, and also for the very important briefings. I would like to also express our deep gratitude to members of the Council for their unwavering commitment to peace, stability, and prosperity in Afghanistan, We also thank those members that expressed their condolences with the people of Afghanistan on the face of recent flood flashes. We are particularly thankful to those who have reaffirmed their support for the Afghan people and highlighted the importance of inclusivity, respect, and protection of the fundamental rights and freedoms of all Afghan citizens, especially women, girls, and minority groups. Additionally, we thank all donors, the UN system, and both national and international NGOs for their ongoing engagement and provision of vital humanitarian and life-saving support to the people of Afghanistan in the time of deep crisis. Mr. President, the United Nations will host the third Doha meeting from June 30 to July 1st, 2024, bringing together special representatives for Afghanistan from various countries. We commend the UN Secretary General's efforts to foster international dialogue and enhance coordinated efforts to address Afghanistan's multifaceted crisis. However, it is disheartening to see a diversion from the primary objective of the previous two Doha meetings. The past two Doha meetings, along with the Security Council Resolution 2721 and the Independent Assessment Report, underscored increasing international engagement in a more coherent, coordinated, and structured manner to achieve an end state of an Afghanistan at peace with itself and its neighbors, fully reintegrated into the international community and meeting its international obligations. This objective cannot be realized without addressing the issue of legitimacy, political process, humanitarian crisis, and human rights situation, particularly the rights of women and girls to education and employment under an integrated and holistic approach. The imperative of addressing political component of Afghanistan's crisis, which remains lack of an inclusive and representative political system that enjoys support and legitimacy from the people of Afghanistan and international community through a political process that includes engagement with all Afghan stakeholders, including civil society and other social and political forces who share a common vision of an inclusive and pluralistic Afghanistan, has long been emphasized by the people of Afghanistan. Commencement of a political process was also reflected in assessment report of the Special Coordinator. It is disappointing that the agenda of the third Doha conference does not include political process and human rights as two crucial issues in their thematic discussions, and that representatives of civil society and women will not be present at the table. This will be perceived as a shift away from the issues deemed essential to the people of Afghanistan and more broadly from the objectives to which international commitments were made, including Security Council resolutions, and it will be viewed as another setback, signaling a normalization without any tangible changes on the ground. We echo the Special Rapporteur's call in his latest report from June to ensure Afghan women are included in all political discussions, including the Doha process. We believe that a more effective and integrated international approach, as called for in the Independent Assessment Report, requires consistent and parallel focus on issues of political process, the humanitarian crisis, and human rights situation, especially with regard to the rights of women and girls to education and employment. More broadly, we have consistently emphasized that international engagement should be principled and aligned with the principles and objectives of the UN Charter and the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We reiterate that any discussions on the future of the Afghan people will not yield any tangible outcomes without addressing core issues and concerns. These include national legitimacy, the Islamic and fundamental human rights of all citizens, including women, girls, and minority groups, and security threats such as extremism, terrorism, and narcotics, which have contributed to the current stalemate. Moreover, experiences has taught us that without ensuring the inclusivity and balanced representation of all relevant and credible Afghan groups, including representatives from women, civil society, the youth, diplomats, and other democratic forces and movements, we cannot achieve enduring peace and stability in the country. The Taliban are only one internal stakeholder and do not and cannot represent the people of Afghanistan as a sole entity. We should not disregard the legitimate demands of the Afghan people, especially women and girls, and normalize a gender apartheid regime in Afghanistan. We hope that the Doha process will consider the recommendations of the independent assessment report and focus on forging consensus among all international and Afghan stakeholders. We urge the UN Secretary General to seriously consider these points and ensure the inclusion of representatives of women and civil society in all discussions on Afghanistan, including the next Doha meeting. The Doha conference presents a vital opportunity for the Taliban and international community to discuss and agree on a roadmap by adopting an action plan or an implementation mechanism with defined objectives and specific timelines. This will support Afghanistan's progress towards becoming an inclusive, united, peaceful, and democratic nation. Mr. President, I would like to reiterate that the people of Afghanistan are tired of conflict and war. They have been longing for durable peace and security and prosperity. This can only be achieved through a legitimate, accountable, and inclusive system of governance based on the rule of law, justice, and the will of the people, with the firm commitments to respecting and protecting the fundamental rights and freedoms of all citizens, as well as Afghanistan's international obligations. This requires joint efforts by the United Nations, international partners, and all relevant stakeholders to work collaboratively and in a good faith toward a stable, inclusive, and prosperous Afghanistan. Only through such comprehensive, coordinated, and unified action can we secure a better future for the Afghan people. In this regard, we reiterate our call for the appointment of a special envoy to ensure dedicated and coordinated international engagements with Afghanistan. Mr. President, Afghanistan faces a dire situation across humanitarian, social, economic, and political fronts, worsened by the Taliban's oppressive policies and disregard for international norms. The country is grappling with a complex humanitarian crisis due to decades of war, displacement, underdevelopment, poverty, food insecurity, natural disasters, and climate change. About 29 million Afghans need humanitarian aid. Millions of Afghan refugees and migrants are in a need of support in our neighboring countries. The 2024 Afghanistan Humanitarian Need and Response Plan is severely underfunded. Aid efforts are further hindered by funding gaps, recent flash flooding, and the Taliban's restriction on Afghan women aid workers, as noted by the previous speakers. The human rights situation is equally dire, particularly for women and girls. Reports from the UNAMA and the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights describe an institutionalized system of discrimination, segregation, and exclusion of women and girls from public life. This includes harsh enforcement of dress codes, arbitrary detention of activists and journalists, public executions, and corporal punishment. Afghanistan is the only country in the world where girls are barred from attending secondary and higher education. These policies and practices are against true Islamic tenets. These acts not only violate fundamental human rights, but also undermine the potential for Afghanistan to achieve a social and economic progress. These violations impact the broader population with extrajudicial killings, torture, and displacement. Ethnic and religious minorities face severe discrimination, worsening social tensions. Civic space has shrunk due to increased restrictions, surveillance, and harassment of civil society and media, stifling decent and critical journalism. This is detailed in the reports of Special Rapporteur Mr. Richard Bennett on human rights situation in Afghanistan. Despite the Taliban's claims of increased revenues, their refusal to comply with international norms and human rights standards has prevented political and economic stability. This has led to withheld aid, worsening the humanitarian crisis, poverty, and food insecurity. The lack of inclusive governance has stalled development and perpetuated suffering, with schools closed to girls beyond 6th grade for over 1,000 days. Mr. President, in conclusion, Afghanistan's well-being, prosperity, and security are not just domestic concerns, but are deeply connected to regional and global stability. At this critical juncture, we urge solidarity and consensus among Security Council members. Unified support and action are essential to address Afghanistan's multifaceted crisis. Together, we can strive for a stable, prosperous, inclusive, and democratic Afghanistan, ensuring the rights and well-being of its people are safeguarded. The continued engagement and support of international community through the UN are essential to achieving this goal. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Afghanistan for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Islamic Republic of Iran.
The compassionate, the merciful. I thank you, Mr. President, for convening this open briefing. I also thank Ms. Otunbayeva, Special Representative, and Ms. Doughton, Director of Financing and Partnership Division, OCHA, for the insightful briefing, and we also listened to the statement of Ms. Wafek. Mr. President, Afghanistan continues to face severe economic and humanitarian crisis worsened by a significant reduction in international aid. This situation is profoundly affecting many people, particularly women and children. The Secretary General report estimates that 23.7 million of Afghans will need humanitarian assistance in 2024. This instability affects neighboring countries, highlighting the need for regional and international cooperation and engagement. Iran remains committed to supporting Afghanistan, keeping its border open to Afghan displaced and refugees during critical times and challenges the Afghan people faced, and hosting more than 6 million Afghans at an annual cost of $10 billion despite sanctions. Iran has provided education to 700,000 Afghan students residing in Iran. Also, to promote peace and stability and strengthen the Afghan economy, Iran continues economic and commercial ties with Afghanistan, focusing on projects like Chabahar port, railways, and alternative crop cultivation to curb drug production. However, Iran faces significant challenges with illegal immigration, drug trafficking, and call for increased international support. Iran seized more than 1,000 tons of Afghan narcotics last year, with many Iranian law enforcement officers losing their lives. Due to the challenging economic condition caused by U.S. illegal sanctions and lack of international aid, Iran cannot manage the influx of Afghan refugees and drugs alone, which impacts the entire region. The Iranian public is frustrated by the lack of international support in managing the refugee and drug trafficking crisis. The international community must provide swift, sufficient, and continuous support to host countries like Iran. Terrorist threats from within Afghanistan continue to pose significant concerns. Iran doubts that de facto authorities' ability to combat these threats effectively. Having said that, Mr. President, continuous international engagement with de facto authorities is crucial for regional peace and stability. Iran actively engaged with the regional initiative aimed at fostering dialogue with Afghanistan, such as neighboring ministerial meeting and the Moscow format. Iran supports Pakistan's initiative to convene meeting of foreign ministers from Afghanistan neighboring countries, with 4 rounds already held and the 5th scheduled in Ashgabat. At Iran initiative, a regional contact group was established, including representatives from Iran, Pakistan, China, and Russia. 2 rounds of this meeting have been conducted so far. During the second meeting held on 8 June in Tehran, the participants expressed deep concerns about the situation in Afghanistan, particularly in the ongoing foreign-backed terrorist threats emanating from the country and affecting neighbors and region. They emphasized that the de facto authorities' responsibility to combat terrorism. Iran advocates for addressing extremism, terrorism, and underdevelopment in Afghanistan and stand ready to play an active role in its reconstruction. Iran welcomed the next round of the Doha processes scheduled for the June 30 and 1st July 2024. Iran recognized that the vital role of the UNAMA in promoting peace and stability in Afghanistan and support the Special Representative of the Secretary General Affairs. During the recent visit SRSG to Tehran on 11 May 2024, discussion focused on assisting the Afghan people and strengthening peace and stability. And finally, Mr. President, I wish to reiterate that the humanitarian aid to Afghanistan must remain impartial and unconditional. Any politicization of aid will harm the Afghan people. As such, frozen assets should be returned unconditionally, and sanctions should not hinder economic revitalization efforts. Western countries, having occupied Afghanistan for over 20 years, must honor their commitments to the country's reconstruction and the fight against terrorism. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Islamic Republic of Iran for his statement. I now give the floor to representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, let me first of all commend the delegation of the Republic of Korea and Ambassador Jungkook for your successful presidency of the Council this month. I would also like to express my gratitude to the Special Representative of the Secretary General and Head of UNAMA, Ms. Rosa Otunbayeva, for her very cogent and thoughtful briefing, and to express our appreciation for the work she is doing in Afghanistan in an extremely challenging environment. I would also like to thank Ms. Lisa Doughton from OCHA and Ms. Wafik for their insightful thoughts at this meeting of the Council. We take note of the Secretary General's report on the situation in Afghanistan. Mr. President, Pakistan has consistently advocated sustained engagement with the Afghan interim authorities to normalize the situation in Afghanistan. We are encouraged that the Afghan interim government has announced its decision to participate in the Doha meeting at the end of this month. This is an opportunity for constructive dialogue on all key issues relating to Afghanistan. It is essential that both the international community and the Afghan interim government should be clear about the overall objectives they seek. Unless we know where we are going, we will never get there. The UN Special Coordinator on Afghanistan, Ambassador Feridun Sinirlioglu, in his report last November, outlined the major issues which need to be addressed to normalize the situation in Afghanistan. He envisaged the formulation of a realistic roadmap with reciprocal steps taken by the Afghan interim government and the international community towards the normalization of Afghanistan and its integration within the international community. Mr. President, the international community, for its part, is obliged to help the 23 million Afghans who need urgent humanitarian assistance. Unfortunately, the Afghanistan Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan has received only 16.2% of the required 3.06 billion for the targeted 17.3 million Afghans. This plan must be fully funded from all possible sources. Second, it is equally important to take adequate measures for the revival of the Afghan economy and to find pathways for sustained development in Afghanistan. This requires reviving the Afghan banking system and restoring commercial activities, including private sector investment. Most critically, we must explore means to create the necessary conditions for the release of Afghanistan's frozen assets and their transfer to its central bank. It is also important to kickstart the planned infrastructure and regional connectivity projects. Pakistan remains committed to expanding trade and economic relations with Afghanistan. In March of this year, Pakistan and the Afghan interim government signed a 9-point agreement on trade and transit issues to help promote economic relations. Mr. President, on the other hand, the Afghan interim government must also take steps to abide by its obligations in conformity with international law and established norms. The world remains concerned about the restrictions imposed on women and girls in Afghanistan. These do not conform with international law or the tenets of Islam. The Afghan interim government is expected to ensure the rights of women and girls to education, work, and other human rights. We also hope that the progress can be made towards promoting greater political inclusivity. We support the efforts UNAMA is making in this direction. This will help to stabilize Afghanistan. Mr. President, the highest priority for the international community, for Afghanistan's neighbors, and for Afghanistan itself remains the elimination of terrorism within and from Afghanistan. While the Afghan interim government is fighting Daesh, the ISKP, and has made some progress, there are a number of other terrorist groups in Afghanistan: Al-Qaeda, the TTP, ETIM, IMU, all these groups against whom the Afghan interim government must take effective and sustained action, including in compliance with the several resolutions of the Security Council. The impunity which some of these terrorist groups seem to enjoy within Afghanistan poses a dire and direct threat to all of Afghanistan's neighbors, as well as to the international community. Ultimately, these terrorist groups will pose a threat to the Afghan interim government itself and to their economic and social development objectives. While these terrorists operate in and from Afghanistan, private sector investment in Afghanistan will remain limited, nor will it be possible to smoothly implement the connectivity and infrastructure projects. And counter-narcotics policies will be frustrated, since several of these terrorist groups are involved in drug trafficking and trade. Mr. President, among these terrorist groups, the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP, poses the most direct and serious threat to Pakistan. The TTP and its associates have been responsible for numerous cross-border attacks against Pakistan, resulting in hundreds of civilian and military casualties. The TTP has acquired sophisticated weapons, which has intensified the lethality of its terrorist attacks. Pakistan has repeatedly conveyed to the Afghan interim government at very senior levels that it must act decisively to halt the cross-border terrorist attacks by the TTP and its associates, disarm the TTP fighters, capture and hand over the TTP terrorists to Pakistan. Unfortunately, despite promises, no meaningful action has been taken so far. TTP safe havens remain close to Pakistan's borders. Cross-border attacks have continued, including one by a TTP associate that killed several Chinese engineers working on the Dasu hydropower project. Mr. President, on 16th March, TTP terrorists belonging to the Hafiz Gul Bahadur group conducted a cross-border terrorist attack which resulted in the martyrdom of a number of Pakistani soldiers. On 18 March, Pakistan carried out intelligence-based anti-terrorist operations in the border regions inside Afghanistan to defend our territory against such cross-border attacks by TTP terrorists. Terrorists were killed, not civilians. The Security Council, Mr. President, has condemned several of these terrorist attacks against Pakistan. The Council should call on the Afghan interim government to sever its links with the TTP and its associates, prevent them from carrying out cross-border attacks against Pakistan, disarm the TTP terrorists, and capture the TTP's leadership and hand them over to Pakistan. We also expect the United Nations to take a similar position, consistent with Security Council resolutions and the reports that have been submitted to the 1267 and the 1988 sanctions committees. The UN should also investigate how the TTP acquired its advanced weapons and the sources of the TTP's funding, including from external sources, which enables the TTP to maintain 50,000 TTP fighters and their families. While UNAMA does not have the counterterrorism mandate, this should not imply inaction by the United Nations. The relevant UN bodies must be activated to enable the United Nations to play its part in putting an end to the terrorist menace which, once again, has emerged from Afghanistan. Mr. President, Pakistan enjoys close bonds of ethnicity, history, faith, language, and culture with Afghanistan, our immediate neighbor. Pakistan has a national compulsion to promote peace, stability, and development in Afghanistan. And we will continue to work at all levels, bilateral, regional, and international, and with the United Nations to achieve these objectives. I thank you, Mr. President.
Pakistan for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank you for convening today's meeting. We appreciate the briefing by SRSG Otunbayeva on the situation in Afghanistan, particularly the recent developments. The insights provided by OCHA and civil society representative was also very useful. Mr. President, India is a contiguous neighbor to Afghanistan. India has historical and civilizational ties with the people of Afghanistan. These long-standing linkages continue to guide our relations with Afghanistan. India is closely monitoring the developments given its impact on neighboring countries like us. Our objective is to establish long-term peace, security, and stability of Afghanistan and well-being of its people. In this context, allow me to place the following observations. 1. Benchmarks set by the Security Council through its Resolution 2593 should continue to guide the international community's approach towards Afghanistan. Our common priorities include the need to counter terrorism, bring in inclusive governance, safeguard the rights and interests of women, children, and minorities, counter narcotics, and prioritize humanitarian assistance for the well-being of the people of the country. It is also important that Afghanistan's territory is not used to spread instability in the region or to encourage extremist ideologies. 2. India has been a trusted partner of Afghanistan for many years in development and humanitarian assistance. India has delivered material humanitarian assistance consisting of 50,000 metric tons of wheat, 250 tons of medical aid, and 25 tons of earthquake relief aid. We have continued educational scholarship to more than 4,000 students, including 600 Afghan girls. We have also partnered with various UN agencies, including WFP and UNODC, in their humanitarian efforts. Our development partnership has included more than 500 projects spread across each of the 34 provinces of the country in critical areas of power, water supply, road connectivity, healthcare, education, agriculture, and capacity building. 3. India have been participating actively in the meetings of Special Envoys on Afghanistan hosted by Qatar in Doha. We strongly support the consensus that international community must move forward on all issues pertains to Afghanistan in a consultative and transparent process. 4. Our bilateral trade and commerce are ongoing, including through the Chabrahar port in Iran. The signing of contract to develop Chabrahar port in Iran recently is a testament to our commitment towards realizing the potential of the place as a connectivity hub for Afghanistan. In closing, Mr. President, we reaffirm our unwavering commitment to the people of Afghanistan. India will continue to extend full cooperation in every initiative to help the Afghan society. I thank you.
I thank the representative of India for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of the speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
Jungkook. Okay.